What is up, everybody? My name is James D. Fiore, and this is Blackballed. I am back after a long hiatus, and I wanted to come back in a way that was most comfortable for the style that I like to deliver and the things that I'm interested in. And I chose a rapper, and it's not just any rapper either. He's making his debut album. He's released his debut album, The Sane Asylum, and I was just talking to him off air, and this is one of those things where you don't normally see, that's his album right there, you don't normally see a person who puts out a debut album with as many features and guests as he has on the album. He was also sort of helped out as far as, I think, his connects go. I don't want to speak for him, by the legendary independent hip-hop artist Sage Francis. And we're going to start the show today by delivering one of the most important pieces, by broadcasting, what am I trying to say here? By playing one of the most important songs that he has on the album. And so we're going to start off with that right this second.
Hey, you say I'm crazy and don't know why I stick with you. Baby, I'll take a risk for a kiss. Pull down that mask, I wanna get sick with you. I watch you walking around in that hospital gown, rocking a frown like Oscar the Grouch. Went from the talk of the town to feeling stuck on the dock, watching you drown. Apocalypse now. Every time I talk to that doctor, I thought of knocking him out like, blah. We've been through hell. I felt fragility. Never been more scared than when I was leaving you in that mental health facility. They didn't want me in the vicinity, cause I was literally thinking of driving a car through the wall to make sure they treated you with dignity, like you did for me when we were young and I was acting crazed. Behaved like a man depraved in manic ways. The damage made from all the fist fights, a human hand grenade. But like gamma rays, you changed me into the man I am today. So go ahead, I won't censor every other word like Zuckerberg.
Pause naturally. Okay. And just like everything else that's happening today, please welcome Old Boy Rhymes to the show. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened there, buddy. How you doing, buddy?
Yeah, what's up? It's all good, man. Halfway through is fine. I can talk about the track.
Yeah. It's good to have you. It's good to see you. You're back. Lots has happened since you were here last time. Please give me a rundown on how this album came to be and why I'm so jealous that you were able to secure so many good features on your debut album.
Yeah, man. Well, number one, I'm super grateful for it, obviously. Since I last spoke to you, essentially a lifelong dream and vision has manifested and materialized. So I guess you'd go back a few years ago, and I was living in Bali at the time, and it was during lockdown, no tourists coming in and out. And a guy I knew in Bali, who I had also known when I lived in San Francisco, he actually grew up with one of my idols, a rapper named Zumbi from a legendary crew, Zion I.
Oh, wow.
And I, he knew I spit and whatnot. And he suggested I reach out to Zumbi and let him know that I was friends with him, which I did. And Zumbi was extremely cool, collaborative, open, humble, all of those things. And he was down to collaborate. So we ended up recording that track, which you hear on the album. And as soon as I got that feedback from a guy who I had looked up to my entire life, like our high school basketball games were bumping Silly Putty with Grouch and Zion I. Like I listened to him all the time. As soon as I got that feedback, it kind of planted a bit of a seed in my head that, hey, why don't I see if I can collaborate with some of these other guys? And I knew I had skill, and real recognizes real. And I ended up ultimately getting in touch and reaching out with Sage just to be a featured artist. And he heard some of the tracks I already had recorded. And again, he was also super congratulatory and then supportive and all of those things. And he initially was just on board to be a featured artist. But as the project started to develop, I reached back out to him again. I saw Sage speaking on a news interview. I think it was PBS or I don't know, something like that, about Strange Famous Records. And he was so cool and so real and authentic. I was like, dude, I should just try to release this on Strange Famous. And I reached out to him, and he really loved the idea. And then he brought in Mopes, and some issues around the initial producer I won't get into, but he brought in Mopes and we decided, hey, let's just like repurpose a lot of this project that had already been done. So Mopes remade some of the songs, and then we made a bunch of others from scratch, including the one you were just talking about.
Yep.
And yeah, it just continued to grow, right? It ended up with 17 featured artists, including a lot of my childhood heroes, Mr. Liff, Locksmith, Brother Ali, Sage Francis, Micah 9. A guy named Tom Thumb is on this album, and I always emphasize it because for whatever reason, a lot of Americans don't seem to know him. He's definitely top 2 or 3 beatboxers of all time. He's an Australian. There's a song on the album that I'm spitting over. It sounds like a produced beat. Every instrumentation on that song is actually a vocal sample from Tom Thumb.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So
We
people
need
like that.
more Rozelles in our life, don't we?
Rozelle is definitely the OG, and I'm sure Tom Thumb would say he inspired him. But if you go and look at a TED Talk that Tom Thumb gives, it's got like 60, 70 million views, right? The guy is, he's called like an orchestra in his mouth. The guy's insane.
I remember where I was. Sorry, just because I mentioned Rozelle. I remember where I was the first time I heard Rozelle beatbox and sing at the same time, and I was just like, "Does he have an extra mouth? Is this a trick?" And and of course it isn't. It's such a wild talent.
It's funny you say that you can remember that, because I can also exactly remember when my Canadian friend had brought it back from the States, and I grew up in Indonesia, and he played it. And we just kept playing it over and over again. Like, how is this humanly possible that you can be singing while beatboxing at the same time, right? Blew my mind.
Yeah, it's crazy. So they say you have your whole life to write your first album, right? And then your sophomore effort, that's where the real kind of like skill, as far as longevity goes, comes out. I don't know how you feel about that, but when you look at the content of your album, it feels like a lot of it is inspired by what's going on in the world today and politics and things like that, and maybe what's gone on in your own life. Do you think that you're the kind of artist that requires not strife, but some sort of like justice topical thing to talk about in order to create art? Or am I feeling that way because of the political bent of this particular album?
No, it's a very, I would say, astute question. So I've thought about it a lot. My favorite reporters, most of them are independent journalists. They have their own Substack. Maybe they were mainstream at some point. They've gone independent. My favorite MCs, I would say 90% of them are what you would classify as some sort of independent or underground artist. A few have broken through. My favorite comedians are those who are more politically incorrect and willing to speak truth to power and also point out kind of flaws and unique insights into things. And I get inspired by people who leverage whatever form of craft that they have to actually try to shed light on things. Now, everybody has a different value system, so some people might just want to go see Carrot Top, right? Some guy, not me, but you get my point. That could be your value system. But when it comes to emceeing, there's a reason I aligned and tried to bring all these legendary artists on, because most of their content has been topical, has been observational, and in many instances, like Makeshift Patriot with Sage, was trying to talk about different forces that are at play. And then you combine that with the fact that I think I've had more of an extreme life, exposed to a lot of polarities, from literally growing up in Alaska, then to Indonesia, living through revolutions, terrorist attacks, all these things that I will talk about, befriending billionaires. I'm friends with ministers and governments. I also was running around in slums with kids and the impoverished people in Alaska. Like, I've seen a lot of different things, and I've gone through a lot of, you could call, hardships as well, painful experiences. So I literally just spit what I see, what I believe, what inspires me. And yes, there's a bent of like justice and anger and hostility, because I believe cynics are actually the optimists among us. I believe people who come across as critical, like my art is heavily critical of a lot of things the United States does. That's not because I hate the United States. It's because I actually believe it can get better and it should be better. Whereas if you want to just make dance music for strippers, more power to you. But that doesn't get me moving.
Welcome to the stage, Carrot Top.
That would sell out.
Yeah. But that's a good point though. Like, and I was thinking when I was listening to this album, I always think, I wonder what happened behind the scenes. So I'm assuming that you were, and maybe I shouldn't assume, but were you able to go into the studio with any of these guys, or was it all done remotely because of geography?
I would say 90%, 80% of the album was recorded. I mean, it was almost done 18 months, 2 years ago, right? It took a long time actually to get it out. So a lot of that was recorded still when there was travel restrictions. Right. Plus, you look at, most people don't realize Brother Ali spends most of his time living in the Middle East. A lot of Sage lives on the East Coast. I was still living in Asia. So yeah, this is a lot of digital communication. I had conference calls even with people like Cut Chemist and Tom Thumb and others. We talk to each other. But yeah, man, hip hop's one of those things. You don't need to assemble a band really to stand in a studio together.
You're a good networker, dude. Like that's a crazy accomplishment. Like, did you? Now, I don't mean this in a bad way, because I think it's just good, like marketing of your own skills. I think it's obviously the end product speaks for itself. But did you feel like you had to sort of be ushered in with someone to make those connections, or were you just able to just cold call people and be like, "Hey, how you doing? I'm Old Boy Rhymes. I'd like to talk to you." Like,
Well, I do have an ability to do business development and to make connections and see bigger pictures. I've done that most of my life, but having Zumbi kind of respect me and do a collaboration, having Cut Chemist reshare, I did my own version of Alphabet Aerobics. When I finally set up an Instagram, I was averse to social media during lockdown. My wife was like, "You're so good. Why don't you actually just stop being stubborn and put something out there?" And Cut Chemist immediately reshared something. And so if I would reach out and say, "Hey, I just recorded this track with Zumbi," like I reached out to Locksmith and he had done a track with Zumbi, like all of a sudden you start building a little bit more relevance.
Yeah.
And then people listened to me spit and they understood I wasn't just some guy in my basement who couldn't stitch rhymes together. I would consider myself a pretty top tier lyricist. And these guys, I think, could recognize that, plus the vision of what I was trying to build. And the initial concept was I was going to do a charity album for people in Bali who had lost 80% of their economy during the lockdown, which was the entire island, right? No tourism. Sage quite astutely pointed out to me that people don't make money off of streaming music anymore. So you're not going to generate much to any type of charity endeavor, but you could spread a message and bring awareness to things. And that's when me and Sage started talking, and it took on a life of its own. But to answer your question, yes, I think it definitely helped, because I've always been able to spit, and some of the frustration that I vent and express in my music, and why my name is Old Boy Rhymes, like I just explained on another podcast, is I felt highly frustrated that I had the capability of doing something that people say that they value, and I had the technical capability, yet I had no means or platform to get it out there. And having a little bit of relevance, call it a cosign, whatever you want, it just sets the stage for somebody,
No, I get that. And it's really kind of inspiring to see, because, as I call myself a hobbyist MC, that's just because I just enjoy it. It's therapeutic for me.
I've heard you, man.
Yeah. To write and rhyme, I'll do it till I'm 80 and I won't care, like I'm just, but as a craft, no one had to teach you cadence. You know what I mean? Like for a guy that hasn't, I'm going to assume that you haven't been in the studio that much before this album, right? Like you were just honing your craft all these years. No one had to teach you things like cadence and things like that. And what I really found interesting is that and I don't know how to put this where it makes sense, but the cadence that you bring, if it was a statement in real life, it would be a political one. Like you sound like a political rapper, I guess, right? Because you have to have that sort of ability to not just like say the words, but to convey through inflection and cadence, the thrust and the political meaning behind those words. And I think you do a really good job in doing that. And, for a second there, I thought there was going to be a mystery track with like Immortal Technique or something. It was so amazing. Like just traversing through the songs and everything. Are you planning on doing live shows with this album? And how interesting is that to talk to promoters and tell them, yeah, I'm a political rapper, and what is it like? Are they gun shy about it? Do you have to do everything independent?
So I would love to. I still live on the other side of the world, but if we could set something up, I mean, most of my audience is not on the side of the world I live, for just the fact that most of my content is around U.S. foreign policy and some of the dynamics there, and there's obviously language issues. In a lot of these markets in Asia, they're not looking for the most intricate rhyme patterns from an American political rapper, right?
Right.
So the touring would be back there, and Sage brought to my attention there, one very well-known MC who was potentially interested in bringing me along after hearing about the album. So I don't know if that will come to pass. That would be an amazing honor if it were.
I hope it's Chuck D. You don't have to say anything, but I hope it's Chuck D.
Yeah, my head would explode.
Yeah.
But and Sage is actually, he's pretty tight with Chuck D, from what I understand. So let's see if that comes to pass. If it does, that would be in the relatively near future. But I've also told Sage, we just need a little bit of time to line it up. I'm happy to come back to the States and line up a tour. Particularly, I would love to do the West Coast, since I used to live in San Francisco and I was born in Alaska. Sage has done shows up in Anchorage. It would be really cool for me to go back there after all these years. And
well, my country's in between those places, so come to Canada, please. We love our political rappers up here in Canada. So
yeah, man. Lee Reed is on my album. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Lee. But
I am. Yeah. Bug 65 is signed to the Strange Famous label too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Lee's amazing. He and I are working on another song that we want to release right before the election, talking about the hyper-partisanship and not buying into this two-party dictatorship.
Yeah, I was gonna let's pivot to that, because I know that you want to talk about politics a little bit. What is first of all, what are your thoughts in the American election? I'm interested in that, because the same thing that I see this election as being largely like 2016. It feels the same. There's an assumption on the Democrat side that anyone that votes for Trump is clearly an idiot, and there seems to be hubris has taken over. There's overconfidence. There's only one candidate ever that's made people, and I'm not one of them, want to run back into the waiting arms of the establishment, and that's Donald Trump. It is easy to not like Trump. I do not like him. I feel like he's one of those guys where if he was running to be prime minister of my country and he represented every single thing that I really loved, I still couldn't vote for him. I just couldn't do it. But then again, the alternative is like the establishment Democrat Party. They really love wars. They like to talk a good game, but they don't back it up with actual, results that say that poor people's lives are getting better, for example. So what are your thoughts? Is it like a hopeless endeavor? It doesn't matter who gets elected. Like, what do you think about all that?
What do I think about that? So I'll tie it into what I've seen and experienced in life, and then what I think about what's going on. So I grew up in a country, or I should say I moved to a country when I was 10 and spent a big part of my life there, that is the fourth most populated country in the world, and the wealth is extremely concentrated. And I mean concentrated to handfuls of families, thousands of people, you could say, 270 plus million people, rich in natural resources, all of these things, yet vast poverty. But the people who are wealthy are extremely wealthy. And a lot of them are actually good people. I went to school. I went to an international school, and that's where they would send a lot of their kids. So I grew up with a lot of the children of the elite, of the power structure. And they were my friends. They're still my friends. They're not all bad people just because they're at the top, but a lot of them are immune from noticing the polarity and maybe the lack of humanity and what's going on. And that has caused some issues in some of those relationships I've had. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because it's very easy to see in a country like that, who is the political class, who is the ruling class. They all do business with one another. They fight with each other in political parties, but in backroom, closed doors, they're going to each other's weddings. They're all part of the same social circle. Right. I know because I've literally been amongst it. Now, the United States was not set up to be that way, but we increasingly are becoming that way. And You can look at the erosion of the middle class, right? And you can look at all the money that's been usurped. I was sitting there during lockdowns, and everybody was watching Cuomo on CNN, and he's reporting about his brother, who's the governor of New York. And to me, if I was sitting in Jakarta and I'm watching the most famous news broadcaster talk about his brother, who's the president, that wouldn't be surprising, because there's a political elite class that are controlling things. And yet a lot of people don't seem to see that in the US. And for me, that cuts across both political parties. It does not matter who is in control, because the vested interests of people trying to make a lot of money, which is fine, it's a capitalist system, but those vested interests over time bring them closer and closer together. They go to the same Ivy League schools. I've got plenty of friends who went to places like Harvard. It's all about networking. These people keep running in the same circles. And over time, they may join different political factions and fight on the surface, but at the end of the day, I feel like the outcome's the same. The United States continues to plummet, and everything from like freedom of the press, infant mortality, non-communicable diseases, obviously all the violence we see there, literacy rates in the US, like math score. You can just look at all these metrics, and the US is heading in one trajectory. And if you point that out, you're like, well, you're on this side or you're on that side. For me, I just want the US to get better and to continue to improve. I want people to prosper. I don't want there to be so much anger and mental health anguish. And this is being driven by both parties. I have not seen it improve under the Democrats or the Republicans. As you just said, the Democrats are warmongers, but let's not forget George Bush and the Project of the New American Century and all the lies that led us into Iraq. I mean, I've seen it on both sides. So how could I possibly, with good conscience, go and run to vote for the Democrats right now, particularly as the presidential candidate was part of funding what's going on in Gaza? But I equally have a huge amount of distaste for Donald Trump. I actually mind some of his policies. My brother served on the DMZ of North Korea. And if you want to switch it up, try to have an open dialogue, see if that changes something, since it hasn't been working for fine, no problem. But you cannot, as the leader of such a complex country, set a tone of conflict, which is what he does constantly. He likes to sow conflict, and you can't do that as a leader. I remember when there were riots, last point, I remember when there were riots, I think it was in Washington, late stage of COVID and Antifa and all of this stuff was happening. And this was when he was still on Twitter, and he tweeted out something like, "Let them come. I've got vicious attack dogs and all the best weapons." And it's like, Jesus, you sound like a military dictator. And I lived in a military dictatorship once upon a time. So I have distaste for both parties is how I feel. And I'm not going to stick my name behind either one of them. I wish the US would rip off the Band-Aid and say, we're done with this until we have term limits, until we end private financing of public elections. Just do some basic things and allow a third-party candidate on stage in all televised public debates. Because I guarantee you, a lot of people could stand in the middle of the Democrats and Republicans and rip them to shreds. How much ammunition would you have to rip these guys apart?
Well, the debate thing has always been a little bit of a meh thing to me, because you don't really learn anything about the candidates.
Exactly.
The host has an agenda for their network. Each candidate has, little pivot statements because they're media trained, or in the case of Donald Trump, they just ignore the question entirely and just say something insulting or something like that. And now I'm not trying to co-sign Joe Rogan and all his beliefs, but one of the most probably the most informative interview of a politician I've ever seen was when he interviewed Bernie Sanders a bunch of years back.
Yeah.
And you had to learn who this guy was. It was like 2.5, 3 hours, whatever it was. And by the time you were done, and Joe Rogan treated him respectfully. This is before he was red pilled, if you want to look at it like that. Like, I don't really look at it like that, but I'm just saying, like, a lot of people do. But you learned about it. It was a conversation. It wasn't like You see him on CNN and there's like 5 other people on the panel. They interview him for 6 minutes. They go to commercial and he's gone. And it's like, well, what did you learn about that? So I think every candidate should. I think Kamala Harris and Donald Trump should go on a show like Joe Rogan so that you can actually try to learn about them. Although I don't have faith that Donald Trump will be a mystery. I think he'll still be kind of the same person. But you know what? Like, even though she belongs to a party that I think is just naturally corrupt, there's something about putting a person in a chair for 2.5 hours where they can't go anywhere. They don't have people behind them. They don't have earpieces. And you can at least ascertain what you think they are. Are they being authentic? Do they have views that surprises you? Are they lying? Like, it's just easier to figure out. It doesn't do anything about the shitty 2-party system that they have down there. And, and I'm schizophrenic about the United States. I love that country. I really do, because I have a lot of friends and family there. I've spent a lot of time there. Even when I went to Washington, D.C., and I know that the power, like the center of power, represents a lot of the injustices that have taken place with decisions that were made there. It's hard not to feel something when you're in Washington, D.C. I don't know. I can't explain it, but I guess maybe you've seen all these places, the Capitol building, the monument and everything, and the Lincoln thing since you were a kid on like movies. And there's a mystique about it. And you kind of want to root for them if they're going to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And that's the tough part.
Firstly, I couldn't agree more. Like, I've thought to myself many times, we should somehow mandate all presidential candidates, if you want to make it a bipartisan podcast, whatever, but they need to sit down in a chair for 2.5, 3 hours. Just as you said, there's no running from that. You get a sense of who they are and their true level of competency, their ability to string together a question on the fly, like what level of knowledge command do they actually have?
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders, talking about him, he was completely screwed by his own party, right? He was screwed by that Democrat establishment. And so that's why I don't run to them. And I wish the US could figure out how we can position ourselves in a way to start to mitigate. Because, I mean, you can look at every marker. We're just heading in one direction. And you can say the stock market's soaring and this, that, or the other. But what about the underlying rot that's going on? Like, I can tell you some very personal stories of people in my family, and some who still lived in Alaska, who went through major mental health crises. And my own brother has had over 30 friends commit suicide in Alaska. And yes, most of them are Native Alaskan, but I've got family all over the US, Florida, Oklahoma, Texas, Georgia, Tennessee, Washington, California, Alaska, blue states and red states. And unless you're in the very wealthy kind of Democrat pockets or some of the wealthy parts of these southern states, there's a huge amount of mental anguish in the US for people who work really hard, who have good hearts and are well-intentioned people who just want to look after their family. But savings have eradicated. I think I read somewhere recently the average American has it's like 60% of Americans have less than $500 in their savings account. Oh, yeah. Most Americans are one medical emergency from a bankruptcy. So we can say what we want to say, but these two parties have not served us. And we want to go into this dynamic of picking left or right. And I don't think it serves us. But I do love the US, as you said. And I grew up in a Muslim majority country as an extremely patriotic American kid. It was only as I got older and I read more and I learned more, and I can talk about some of the things I saw in Jakarta, and it's just, I'm disenchanted, let's say, but it doesn't mean I don't love the country.
I don't blame you. Like, listen, it's hard to be enchanted with what's going on right now. And listen, let's get the Israel-Gaza thing out of the way, because I know that is something that, not out of the way, but it is such a difficult topic to talk about sometimes, because there's all these landmines, like there's all these, like, I have friends who are steadfastly, I support Israel no matter what, and they are good people, and they, so it's not like, I would never have the audacity to sit there and just wipe the slate for every single person that supports Israel as a bad person or ignorant or anything like that. It's more complex than that. Do you feel like when people bring up history, like that, it's hard to figure out how long back you have to go before it's too far back? You know that, right?
Yeah, I hate that talking point because, firstly, I agree with you. Like I have nothing but respect for most Israeli people. Most people are not their governments. The United States, the average American was not George Bush, right? So like you can separate the people versus their government, and there are plenty of good people over there. But yeah, that talking point of, this is so complex, it can never be figured out. And then a lot of the Zionists will say, well, if you really go back far enough in history, this is undeniably based on religious scholarship. This is our land. But I say this all the time, and I think you and I mentioned it on the last time I spoke with you, but let's just agree with that line of thinking, okay? And let's also recognize what we did in the United States to Native Americans. And so if there was a Native American community who in 2023 came along and said, you know what, we've just armed ourselves to the teeth and we're taking this place back. You would obviously expect all the modern day inhabitants of that place who you just expelled by force to arm up themselves and come back.
Yeah.
Because you had ancient title to this land 3,000 plus years ago, which is still debatable. I mean, that doesn't really hold water to me. And
Well, and also there's the argument that the Israelis say that they're the natives, right?
I mean, I can go into I'm sure there's plenty of experts around this. Like, I don't understand why Israelis are considered their own race. Jews are considered their own race. Like, Palestinians you can get into Christianity. Jesus was a Palestinian Jew. I mean, there's like a lot of, yes, confusing things going on there. But what's not confusing is that if you just go back and look in the late 1800s and the history of Herschel and Zionism as a movement, which came out of a lot of the nationalism sweeping Europe, and they looked at other countries first. Uganda was even a place they were looking at to create the Jewish homeland. And yes, their people went through the worst atrocities of all time. But you can't just carve up a map and displace people who were actually inhabiting a place and then over time continue to exclude them, continue to occupy them, continue to control and limit them, and think a human being is not going to just resort to more extremism. So it feeds on itself. And I think they actually prosper. That military state, that right-wing military state in Israel actually prospers off of the extremism that they generate, right?
Yeah, when you find out that that through Qatar, that
Mm.
Benjamin Netanyahu was
Yeah,
fund Hamas,
yeah.
all of a sudden that human shields argument that they make when they drop bombs from 5,000 feet onto hospitals and residential buildings and things like that, there's an abstract parallel to that, which is if you're funding the terrorists that you say are attacking your people, aren't you kind of using your own people as cannon fodder at that point?
Yeah, I mean, what really irritates me is we already lived through this in a different way, right? Which was Iraq. Post 9/11, we were attacked in a horrific way, but then the drums of war and the amount of fear that was used to enact a pre-formulated agenda that had basically already been on the cards for a while. It's the
When you
same
have
thing.
Richard Pearl in your inner circle, something's wrong.
And so let's get to that, right? I was living in Indonesia, the biggest Muslim country in the world, as a kid when 9/11 happened. When I arrived in Indonesia, it was everybody loved the United States. By the time I left, I was telling people I was from your country, that I was Canadian.
Yeah. A lot of people do that. Yeah.
The amount of things we saw, and I'll give a few stories if you don't mind me getting into details.
Please go ahead.
So in 2002, there were two massive terrorist attacks on two nightclubs in Bali that were bombed. I think like 180 people passed away. Now, those two clubs, Sari Club and Patty's, I partied at many times. Even though we were underage, we were kids in high school, nobody cared in Indonesia back then. I'd partied in those places many, many times. And when those bombs went off, they weren't just little backpack, tiny little bombs, right? They initially set off a medium-sized bomb in one of these clubs, which was across the street from the other. Everybody ran into the street, and they detonated a gigantic bomb out of this van. Well, the week that attack took place was supposed to be our school break. And thankfully, the school had shifted it just a few weeks before. Otherwise, we would have all been in those clubs. Unfortunately, one of my teachers was a guy who I really liked and was close with, and probably only a few days before that happened, I was walking by his classroom. He's a Kiwi guy named Jamie Wellington. He pulled me into his class, was showing me pictures of his new daughters, his new kids who were born. And that poor guy was dropped off in front of that nightclub seconds before the bomb went off. They never found pieces of him. So what happened from there was, quite rightly, a lot of fear and panicking. There was a lot of religious fundamentalism sweeping through things. And my school ended up being targeted by a terrorist cell, the same ones that were responsible, or at least affiliated with the ones responsible for that nightclub bombing. And they uncovered a plot to put bombs on all of the school buses. The traffic is so terrible in Jakarta that all of our school buses would come out of school and would be sitting there stuck in traffic. And easy opportunity for these guys to come, and they were going to put sticky bombs underneath the buses.
What was, can I ask you, just stop you right there and ask you what the group was?
If I could Google it. I mean, it's
okay. Was it just like radical Islam kind of group? Was that?
Oh yeah, extreme.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
They say, you know, some of these guys had served time in Afghanistan, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Had some allegiance or affiliation through different imams and whatnot up to Osama bin Laden, is what they were saying. So the school closed down for 6 weeks. Our school was on the cover of, like, I think it was New York Times or Wall Street Journal at the time. When we came back, we had grenade nets hanging over our school. We had Gurkhas, which are badass soldiers from Burma or Nepal,
yeah.
And standing in front of the school. And it was quite scary, right? You started this era that I came when everybody loved the United States. This was dramatically changing. Every now and then you could see a mural of Osama bin Laden in a few places popping up. I was attacked by a group of 30 plus Indonesians, men and women. Me and my Israeli friend actually beat out of us, had to run for our lives. I saw a lot of these things. And even as an adult, I was involved in a terrorist attack and responding to it in Jakarta, when one of my clients who was next to the United Nations, where there's a terrorist attack taking place, called me, machine guns going off. The company I worked for was involved in medical and security response. So I won't go into all those details, but I lived around a lot of these things. And yet, I have seen and experienced more violence in the United States. And so what blows me away is that these things are terrible, but they are more one-offs. I feel way more safer in the largest Muslim country in the world than I do in the United States. But the average American, because their perception is shaped by propaganda and fear constantly over and over and over again, they don't know that. So I would return to the US. Every time I'd go through the airport, step aside, sir, you have to go into the extra line to get the extra frisk. Yeah. And so many Americans are, Chris, how can you live in a Muslim country? It's like terrorists, like you're scared. It's terrible. Yes, those things did happen, but I've seen people shot to death in the US. I've had guns pulled on me in the United States. I had a friend shot to death in San Francisco. My wife's father was on a bus in Vermont that was hijacked, had a shotgun put directly into his forehead. My wife's aunt and uncle, or great aunt and uncle, were murdered in their house, shot to death. Like, the amount of violence, gun violence, and many other things I saw in the US is way more than anything I actually experienced in the Muslim world. So you can't say that fundamental Islam didn't exist. Of course it did. And there was a lot of extremism and terrible things that took place, but a lot of fear gets whipped up. And so Americans don't actually realize that there's degrees to these things. Yes, they were happening, but we're just propagating all of this fear. And I feel like a lot of that propaganda making has taken place once again in this whole Gaza situation. When you see these debates taking place on stage, of course we can bomb Gaza. They were the most genocidal. They're so genocidal. How are they genocidal? They don't have the means to commit genocide on a nuclear power that is backed by the United States. Like, it is just
it's a weird contrast, because the Hamas charter does implicitly state a genocidal statement, but those words that's tough to match the artillery and the nuclear power of the country that they're talking about. So it's like, Israel doesn't actually come out and say we want to wipe all of the Palestinians off the map. They just have the weapons that make them come closer to being able to wipe them off the map, while the other side that can't possibly wipe Israel off the map says implicitly we want to. And so it's a weird game of words. I want to touch on something before we go into that a little bit more, because it's interesting. I'm just going to be honest with you. I might be one of those guys. Like I've never been to a Muslim country, but I've been to the United States, and the most frightened I've ever been in my life is a few instances in the United States. But if someone were to ask me, where would the last place you want to be right now? I'd probably say in a Pashtun-controlled area of Pakistan. Like if someone just dropped me off there with this nose, I think I would be fucking like targeted immediately. And I don't know if that fear is something that is understandable, or if I'm a victim of the propaganda myself. But there are certain areas in the world, like Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, Pakistan, in certain places, wherever, where I feel like, as a guy that looks like me, it's the last place in the world I'd want to be. Give me fucking downtown Detroit at 3 a.m. before I go to Pashtun, Pakistan. Is that fair, or am I a victim of the propaganda? Be honest. I'm fine with whatever the answer is, right?
Of course not. I don't want to be in those places either. Obviously, you're focusing on places that are extremely militant across the board, and there's known hotbeds of extremism there. Gaza, yes, obviously Hamas is there, but you're dehumanizing it by saying we're going to wipe out everybody. They're all genocidal. That's what I'm saying. This fear gets propagated. So there are plenty of places in the United States. There's plenty of places all across the globe I wouldn't want to step foot in. I'm just talking about how we shape perception, because the reality is different, right? Some Hamas, a small group that doesn't have a lot of means to actually enact what they're saying, could be putting out genocidal rhetoric. Why would they do that? Because it helps reaffirm their position of power in the small territory that they're ruling. Extremism is how they actually self-justify their existence, right? But they're a small fraction of the people who are actually living there. And the real power sits with Israel. I've seen countries where if they want to make a new mall, they just go and burn down the slums in the air. They don't care who's there. That's real power, right? And Israel has that power. And the citizens of Gaza do not. No one's even talking about the West Bank that's not even directly related to the attack in Gaza. So for me, you're not falling victim to propaganda by not wanting to be in certain parts of Pakistan. I mean, that's obvious.
I used a pretty extreme example, but I did. It's funny though, because here, I'll give you the other side of that coin. I on a business trip last year, I went to London in the UK, and a friend of mine there linked me with like an unofficial Airbnb. He had a buddy who was in Scotland on a fishing trip, and so I paid to use that apartment for the 8 or 9 days or whatever that I was there. He didn't tell me that apartment was in East London, and one of the most infamous, conservative Muslim areas ever. Luckily, I had this beard without a mustache, and I was wearing a lot of Air Jordan gear, and it was a lot of "Assalamu alaikum, my brother," and I was like, "How you doing, my brother?" Like, I just didn't know what else to do. But then what happened was really interesting. I don't remember what day it was because I don't know if there's like a Sabbath kind of version of an Islamic week, whatever. But I called a prayer, and I'm an atheist, and I was like, it's actually pretty fucking beautiful, like listening to it. And then the store that I would visit was right beside the mosque, and it was like the friendliest group of people I had ever associated with in a religious setting ever. And I was outside. I didn't go in. I didn't want to disrespect anybody, right? I was just outside. But they would nod and talk to me and call me their brother and everything. Now, I don't know if they thought I was Muslim because of my beard or if they were just being nice. It didn't matter to me. It was amazing. Now, to contrast that, I've had really horrible experiences outside, Christian churches in like Tennessee, where they would like look at my Public Enemy shirt and literally start calling me an N-word lover. And I was just like, when you contrast those experiences, it's really easy. If you've never had either of those experiences, to just live fearful, right?
Yeah. So and I'm not only talking about Indonesia, I live in a different Muslim country now, and folks are religious, pious. I don't see violence. There's not political, at least in the places I'm living in. So you can definitely identify hot spots and areas where there's more fomenting extremism and the dynamics behind that. But if you're talking about a broad swath of billions of people on planet Earth, like I've been to the deepest slums in some of the poorest parts of Indonesia, and these people live extremely dignified. They live in as wholesome a way as possible. They will receive you and welcome you, and you would not hesitate to spend time around these people. Whereas I have also been into poor parts of some of the, you could say, southern states or even liberal cities in the United States, and I wouldn't want to shake any one of those people's hands. So it's easy to like lose touch with humanity with these like way overarching blanket narratives. You know, my grandfather.
Dubai is apparently the safest place ever.
I would say Singapore, for sure. Singapore.
Yeah.
Dubai is home to a lot of human trafficking and a lot of illegal money laundering that goes through there. Singapore now I think is almost top in the world in terms of GDP per capita and per capita income. It's a tiny little island. It's a nanny state. It's only had one political party, but nothing bad happens there. I'm saying any woman of any age could be walking around at 3 a.m. and you just would never even conceive that anything could happen. I wouldn't want to live there because it's a little bit too controlled, but my father spent a big part of his childhood there, so I've been there quite a bit.
It's expensive there too, isn't it?
It's insane, like unbelievably expensive. Yeah. Top.
And a lot of these things, it should be pointed out that a lot of these places that are safe because the ramifications and the consequences of doing something wrong there are pretty insane.
True. Especially in Singapore, they're very famous for caning. There was a famous
American college students for smoking weed and shit like that, right? Like,
the famous one was in the 90s. Is a guy who went to the Singapore American School, which is the same school my dad went to once upon a time, and he was busted tagging, doing graffiti on some fancy cars. Right. Yeah. What made it worse is that his dad was the U.S. ambassador, and they were going to cane him, and Bill Clinton had to intervene, and all of these things. You just don't mess around there, you know.
When you went to school with those with the children of the elite, did they have a concept of the sort of lack of fairness or let's put it this way, the gap between where they were and where the poor were? And did they have a sort of political conscience, any of them?
Yes and no. So again, as I said, a lot of these people are actually very good people. They're good friends of mine. A lot of them are very westernized. They go to universities in the West. They're all into Western culture. And so a lot of them have the same, at least some of the democratic principles and virtues and ethics and things that we all do. But at the same time, I could say, at least for some of them, I did sense a strong disconnect between the plight of their people and the vast accumulation of wealth that their family had inherited. And sure, they have all sorts of their own political pressures and things of this nature. But I had some friends that I'm like, hey, you've got endless amounts of money. All you do is travel around and party and Playboy and go country to country and have, I'm talking wealth you can't fathom, right? I'm talking billionaire level of wealth. Why don't you spend your time trying to improve the country? And it's just not really a thought that clicks into a lot of their heads. Now, a guy I do know who's very wealthy, is currently a minister, like he stepped into the fray to try to push the country ahead. But the vast majority of them, I just don't think they were taught to really see and think of things that way. And it's
funny how that crosses borders with especially the children of the wealthy. You know, where they don't even have a fathomable idea or have never been, ingratiated towards the idea of a lack of fairness.
Yeah. I partied with one of these guys. I partied with Eduardo Saverin, who's the co-founder of Facebook, right? Yeah. He's now a Singaporean. He gave up his U.S. citizenship. He's the wealthiest man in Singapore. And when I was like 26, right after the Facebook movie came out. One of
Hey,
these.
by the way, can I just say that's
Yeah.
a perfect movie. Like, I'm not saying it's even my favorite. It's just a perfect movie. They did such a good job with that. Anyway.
Yeah, that guy's a great director.
Yeah.
And anyways, he showed up. I had no idea who he was. Just with my rich Indo friends, we're at a big nightclub downtown Jakarta. Since he's a very famous, powerful guy, I should probably not share any more details. But my point being, like, wealthy American elite. I had no idea how he was connected with my wealthy Indonesian friend. And that aspect definitely crosses borders, and sometimes I won't say lack of empathy, but almost lack of awareness or lack of even conscientiousness about what's going on with other people. And last thing I'd say on that is I've thought about it a lot, and the same way we pity poor people for not having access to resources so they can experience more comfort and pleasure and travel and vacation, in a weird, sick way, in some ways, I also pity the ultra rich because they've never experienced poverty and been around true poverty, and they've never had to face, all sorts of uphill battles, and they've never really had to go and develop their own resiliency. They've never truly had to overcome tons of hardship, maybe political pressures and the stress that comes with being rich and a political elite person, but they don't get the broad swath of experience just like poor people do. And it's a handicap. A lot of them are handicapped.
Yeah, no, it sounds like that. Well, listen, we have a few minutes left. I wanted to quickly touch on the album again. And and Brother Ali, like, what a legend, were you able to discuss with him over the phone the ideas for the track and what you were kind of hoping to see? Like, tell me how that process went, because I would imagine I listening to the entire album, I was like imagining myself networking with these guys as like a debut album scenario, and it just it made me like I had a conversation once years ago with Talib Kweli. We talked on the phone for like 90 minutes about this project that I was doing in Miami. And it was just like, I got off the phone. I was like, that was fucking amazing. Like, that was one of my heroes. You must have experienced a version of that with someone, guys like Brother Ali. And I was just wondering if you could take me through the experience.
So Brother Ali is an absolute legend. Literally, it was probably only 2.5 years ago. I was at my house in Bali listening to his music and just thinking to myself, he's got to be on my top 5 bucket list of people I would love to collaborate with. And the fact that I have collaborated with him now, and the fact that on his own podcast, like less than a month ago, him and Sage Francis are there talking about me, and Brother Ali's saying, can't wait for the album to drop. He loves the album, loves my voice. Like that's kind of manifesting. I hate everybody uses the term manifesting, but in a short period of time that happened, and it was very mind-blowing for me because I have the utmost respect for him as I do for Sage. And so the original version of that song, I reached out to them, and I initially talked to, forgetting his name right now, but he's the main DJ and partner of Brother Ali. They liked what I had recorded. Brother Ali laid down his verse, which played off. Like, I talk about divide and conquer. He puts divide and conquer into his verse. He liked a lot of the themes that I'm talking about. When I talk about the hyper-partisanship in that song, it's really because I would like America to be unified, not divided, which is why he touched upon a lot of that.
And by the way, I think you're thinking of DJ Ant. Maybe not. Okay.
I can't remember. But, so we had that song down. And then when Sage and I decided to release the album Through Strange Famous, we actually decided to repurpose the beats. So Mopes came in, and he built a lot of that instrumentation around it.
Oh, wow.
And the original song was called Somehow, and we had a gospel type of sample on the hook. And Sage decided, most people don't realize Sage is the one singing Somehow on the hook of that song.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Oh, wow.
Yeah. We're about to drop the music video in, I would say, less than 10 days. It's a really dope, fully fleshed out music video. It's very artistic and interpretive. It's dope. And I put Sage's name on the credits intentionally for the video because he was like, nah, you don't list me on the song. It's just a simple hook.
Yeah.
But come on, Old Boy, Brother Ali, and Sage Francis sounds
Yeah.
awesome to me.
Yeah. It's doing you a favor to put his name on it. Like, you know?
That's what I'm saying.
Well, listen,
But-
the album once again is called Sane Asylum. Dude, you can come back anytime you want. I would love to take a look. When is that video dropping, by the way?
I would say within the next 10 days, we're going to drop another teaser for another song on there called Faith Healer. We shot kind of half of the video, you could say, as a bit of a teaser, and then we're going to drop that full album. Let me shout out the guys who I shot it with. A guy named Charlie Balk. He's based in Bali. He's shot on films for Kendrick Lamar, Wiz Khalifa. The guy's super dope. And my buddy Pablo Fernandez. They helped bring kind of my vision that I had for this song to life. I'm not into videos that are just rappers constantly rapping to the camera. There is a little bit of that, but there's a lot more artistry, I would say, infused into the concept. So
Awesome.
Hope you dig it.
I'm sure we will. Old Boy Rhymes. The album once again is called Sane Asylum. Thank you for joining us today, man. I really appreciate it.
You're the man.
Thanks, buddy.
Talk soon.
Old Boy Rhymes, dude, that was a great. I love having conversations with guys that know what they're talking about, aside from what they are on the show for. So he's obviously a dope rapper, but he's able to speak eloquently about these political issues. And whether you agree with him or not, you know it's coming from a learned standpoint. The guy's been all around the world and reflected in his worldly experiences the content that is on his album. Once again, that album is called The Sane Asylum. And we will see you next time on Blackballed.
Blackballed. Blackballed. Blackballed. Blackballed. Blackballed.